Hi, my name's Alex, and in this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I'm going to walk you through how to sculpt cloaks and clothing for tabletop miniatures. So the first thing I want to show you guys as far as sculpting clothing is how to make robes, and the robes that I'm going to be making in this video are going to be based off of classic wizard robes. The first step, as you can see, is to start building up the torso. And when you're doing this, what you're going to want to keep in mind is where the clothing is going to bunch up and then also where it's going to be stretching. Where the material is thicker is where it's going to be bunching up, and where it's going to be thinner is where it's going to be stretching. Once you have a fairly basic shape, you can start working on some of the folds and creases that are going to be in the clothing. As you see here, I take my angular chiseled rubber sculpting tool and I just add some simple lines across the shoulders where the material is going to be stretching. As far as sculpting material goes, this is probably one of the easier types of thing to do because you don't have to worry about how the material folds over top of itself and just adding some lines to show that it's stretching. Once you have that in a place where you like it, you can start working on the sculpting for the lower part of the torso where the robe has bunched up. So after readjusting the torso a little bit, I go in and start adding the folds and creases. The general shape that you're going to try to mimic is a kind of like a zigzag shape that you can kind of see me doing here. But honestly, the best thing you can do is look up reference. That way you know exactly what it's supposed to look like so you can try and replicate that on your miniature. And here you can see again, I'm mostly using the wedged rubber sculpting tool for these folds because I find that it just does the job best. You'll also notice that I'm not sculpting the back of the miniature, and that's because I'm just going to be adding a cloak that's just going to cover it, so there's no point in sculpting something that you won't even see. Main stuff is to make sure you have a good separation between the arm and the clothing. This is very important because if you don't do this with your miniature, people aren't going to know exactly what they're looking at, which obviously we don't want. So it's super important to have defined separation between different parts of your miniature. I then go in to make sure that there's a little indent in the baggy part of the sleeve so that people don't look at it and think that it's just one massive chunk of sculpting material, but it actually looks like a sleeve and piece of cloth that is hanging down from this person's arm. I then go in and add some creases and folds into the sleeve to really make it feel kind of billowy and emphasize the fact that it is clothing. Now we can move on to work on the lower part of the robe, and this is where it can get kind of tricky. As you can see here, I added onto this sculpture a thin sheet of green stuff, and I'm working it with one of the larger metal ball sculpting tools. The trick with doing textiles and clothing this way is that the more you work it, the more you're going to mess it up. Because when working with green stuff that isn't attached to an armature, you can oftentimes overwork the green stuff, and that will often cause it to rip and kind of fold in weird ways. So the best thing you can do is to not touch it too much and be very, very selective with where you sculpt. With that said, what you're probably going to end up doing is have weird creases where there is an armature. And to avoid that, you're going to want to lift the green stuff over top of that, as you see me doing here, almost overemphasizing the crease in the other direction, and then with a rubber sculpting tool, flatten that back out. Again, just remember that the key is to not overwork it. This can be very, very tricky, so don't worry if it's not coming out perfectly the first time you do it. You just need to keep practicing this, and the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. So the next thing I want to show you guys how to do is how to do like large billowing cloaks or capes. And what you're going to want to do is cut out a small piece of wire, and with a bit of green stuff you're going to attach it to your miniature, create a bit of an armature for the cape that you're going to make. As you can see here, I added 2 wires to the back of my miniature, and I go in with a little bit of green stuff and cover those up so that they're easier to add more green stuff to when I'm sculpting out the cloak. And then you're going to want to flatten out the green stuff you add to these so that they're easier to cover up when we're adding the other green stuff. And now, as you see here, I go in with a large flat piece of green stuff. You will note that I don't go over the closer piece of wire that we added before because I'm going to add that little bit of the cloak later. And something that can be good to know is that this first layer of green stuff that we're adding for the cloak is not going to be the final layer. So you don't have to worry about being super precious with it because we're going to be adding more green stuff to it later to make sure that it looks right. For now, what you're going for is the general shape of the cloak that you're going to make, which again, as I said earlier, is useful to have reference for. Also, something that can happen sometimes is that your green stuff will fold in a little bit of a weird way. And luckily, that's not the end of the world because oftentimes the way it will fold is fairly realistic to how a fabric might fold. So more often than not, you can let it set and then pull up a couple more reference images and make it work. Here you can see me adding the little bit of green stuff that I mentioned I hadn't added earlier. And this is why we added the wires, because the green stuff hasn't set yet while I'm working on this, but I can still blend the green stuff together on this wire. And then you're just going to want to make sure that this first layer of green stuff for the cloak is where you want it to be before you let it set. And I would suggest you let it set for over a day so that it's fully set so you can work on it later without having to worry about it moving at all. Once it has set, you can start adding some more green stuff to it. And so what I'm doing here is I've got a mixture of green stuff that is more yellow stuff than blue stuff. And I mix it in with a combination of the rubber tool and the metal tools as needed. Something to keep in mind that I always do when I sculpt this kind of thing is I focus on making the shapes that I'm doing as fairly defined and angular. As much as we associate cloaks with being kind of billowy and round and soft, I find that it's more helpful when sculpting miniatures to make them very angular so that people have a better idea of what they're seeing when they look at the cloak. And as much as these tips are helpful, I cannot express to you how important it is to use reference, especially if you're a beginner. Nothing will help you more than having an image of what you're trying to sculpt in front of you, because then you know exactly what it's supposed to look like, so that you don't end up sculpting something, leaving it for 15 minutes to set, and then realizing when you come back that it just doesn't look right, and there's nothing you can do to fix it now that it's already set. So make sure that you always use reference. With that said, whenever you're adding green stuff, you should always make sure that you add it to the tops of the folds that you're adding into your cloak. This will help make sure the folds in your cloak are nice and intense, and that the overall look of your cloak is nice and dramatic. Adding these nice super billowy cloaks to your miniature is really great if you want to create a sense of motion in your miniature, especially if you're doing a diorama or something that's a little bit more artistic rather than just for tabletop games. And then when you have the cloak where you like it, you just add a little bit of more green stuff to the underside of the cloak as well as the edges to make it nice and clean, and then your cloak is finished. Thank you so much for watching that video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell. All that stuff is super helpful, especially for a small channel. I hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any questions or comments or ideas for videos, leave them in the comments below. Anyways, once again, thank you so much for watching that video, and I'll see you in the next one.